Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar about the Nisqually Community Forest. My name is Brian Bowden. I am the president of the Nisqually Community Forest Board of Directors. So the purpose of our presentation tonight is twofold. Our first objective is to provide you with a broad overview of who we are and how we started and what we are doing to manage forest lands that we've acquired so far. Our second objective is to interact with all of you. We hope to accomplish this via a facilitated question and answer session after a couple of presentations. So in just a moment, I will introduce our board of directors, and then after that, we will provide two presentations that are designed to better inform you about how and why we got into this and what our management approach is. Our large vision, though, is forest management that benefits our local communities by providing family wage forestry and milling jobs, protecting critical salmon and wildlife habitat, and supporting local public outdoor recreation activities. Following these presentations, we will have a question and answer session with the board. Our facilitator will choose and read questions from the audience that you submit online. I encourage all of you to submit any questions you have while we're giving these first two presentations, and to continue doing so during the interactive session as time permits. I will now introduce our board of directors, starting with myself. My name again is Brian Bowden. I'm a retired National Park Service planner who worked for the National Park Service for over 35 years. The last 13 years of my career was working at Mount Rainier National Park in a function that was called a community outreach planner. During that time, I was deeply engaged with the Nisqually Watershed Council, the Nisqually Land Trust, and the Nisqually River Foundation in discussions about commercial forestry operations within the Nisqually Watershed. Those discussions evolved into a very formal exploration of the emerging idea of community forestry as an alternative management approach to commercial forest operations. And then I retired in 2014. And shortly thereafter, several of us who had been involved in those exploratory discussions decided it was time to quit talking about it and put our words into action. So we formed a board and created the Nisqually Community Forest. You will hear more about this in our following presentations. Now I will introduce the rest of our board. Justin Hall is our vice president, and Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, yep. My name is Justin Hall. I'm a trained forester with a background in silviculture, fisheries, and wildlife biology. As Brian said, I'm currently the vice president of the Nisqually Community Forest, but my day job is as the executive director of the Nisqually River Foundation. I like to say I get paid to say the word Nisqually a lot. Between that, time with the River Foundation and working to lead Pack Forest, I've been working in the Nisqually Watershed for over 20 years now. And I will be your moderator for the question and answer session. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A. Please feel free to type questions that you have in there, and we will bring those questions to the panel at the end. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Our next board member is Joe Kane. Joe?
Thanks, Brian. I'm Joe Kane. My day job, and my day job for the next 48 and plus 12, 60 hours is as executive director of the Nisqually Land Trust, where I've been employed for 15 years. And before that, I was on the board for 5 years, and I stepped down from my executive director position at midnight on Saturday night. I'll continue through the end of the year as a staff member handling special projects there, and will continue to serve on the Nisqually Community Forest Board.
Thank you, Joe. Our next board member is Kirk Hanson. Kirk?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Good evening, everybody. I am the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group, and I and my organization are the forest managers for the Nisqually Community Forest. And later this evening, I'll be telling you a little bit about our silvicultural strategy for the community forest.
And our next board member is Paula Swedeen. Paula?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So my name is Paula Swedeen, and I have been working on forest conservation and forest management issues in the Pacific Northwest for about 30 years. I have a background as a wildlife biologist, And then somewhere along the way, I started to work on figuring out how to pay landowners to grow older forests with bigger trees that provide habitat for things like spotted owls and marbled murrelets and salmon. And so I've been doing that in various capacities and started interacting with Nisqually because of their innovation and receptivity to doing fun and interesting things. So I started working with folks in the Nisqually about 12 years ago. And then Joe asked me to come serve on the advisory board when he was thinking about putting his community forest together. And I have been with this group of folks ever since then. My day job is the policy director of Conservation Northwest. And we work on connecting, protecting, and restoring wildlife and wildlands of the Pacific Northwest, and the Nisqually fits very perfectly into our landscape of interests. Of one of our big projects is connecting the Cascades to the Olympics, and so this work is a professional interest to me, but also just seeing forests return to local control and long-term management for long-term ecological sustainability is near and dear to my heart. So I am honored to be able to participate with this group of folks and help make that a reality.
Great, thanks, Paula. You have one more board member that I don't believe is on the screen at this time. His name is George Walter. George is the environmental program manager for the Nisqually Indian tribe. So with that said, that's who we are. Now we're going to give our first presentation, and that will be to give you a little bit of the background about how we came to be. And I will turn the camera over to Joe Kane.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Let's see if I can get this up and moving here. Okay, everybody should have a nice picture of Busy Wild Creek in front of them. Thanks to all my fellow board members for setting this up tonight, and thanks to all of you who've come and are attending. We'll give you a little background on the community forest and then turn it over to Kirk, who'll show you just what we're doing on the ground. What we'd like to start, those of you who attended our salmon recovery webinar know we'd like to start with a geographical location to help folks orient themselves. For people who are not familiar with the Nisqually Watershed, the Nisqually Indian tribe has prepared a locator map for us. And the Nisqually Watershed happens to be located right in the center of the universe. And within the center of the universe, diving deeper, we have the watershed itself. The spine of the watershed, of course, is the Nisqually River, which starts on a glacier. Nisqually Glacier in Mount Rainier National Park flows 36 miles to the Alder-LeGrand Dam Complex, and then another 42 miles to Puget Sound. And that lower 42 miles is the salmon-producing portion of the Nisqually main stem. The major tributary to the Nisqually is the Michelle River, and the headwaters of the Michelle River is Busy Wild Creek. The Nisqually Community Forest is located in the very headwaters of Busy Wild. Here's another quick orientation for you to show you where the community forest is located. We have Elbe Hill State Forest to the east, Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, or to the west, Gifford-Pinchot National Forest to the east, and the Nisqually Land Trust Mount Rainier Gateway Reserve to the south. That's lands dedicated to habitat for marbled murrelets and northern spotted owls, two of the listed endangered species in our watershed. And we're right above Ashford. Many of you will know Ashford from Copper Creek Inn and Wellspring Spa, near the entrance to Mount Rainier National Park. And here is the Nisqually Community Forest. This is the view from the headwaters of Busy Wild Creek looking downstream to the west. The Michelle Subbasin has, since at least the mid-1900s, been a zone of fairly heavy commercial forestry. This shot is from about 2015, and you can see the Michelle River drainage through here in Busy Wild Creek. This is where its cursor is that is federally designated critical habitat for steelhead, one of our two listed salmon species. The community forest is at the very headwaters of Busy Wild Creek. Way back when, oh boy, about 2008 or so, we began to notice changes in the way, and this was happening across the country, changes in the way timberland was owned and managed, commercial timberlands. Increasingly, the ownership was globalized, and the production was globalized too. The products were going out not just across the states, but in fact across the ocean with heavy demand from Asia. Meanwhile, timberlands became great investments for far-flung investors, global investors. And we saw in the watershed a kind of a distancing between the ownership and management of our commercial timberlands and our local communities. These timberlands continue to have heavy impact on local jobs, on wildlife habitat, on recreation and tourism. We had seen in the Michelle watershed heavy timber activity in the mid 1900s and through the 70s and 80s that led to a crash in the populations of our steelhead trout and Chinook salmon, which is what caused them both to end up listed under the Endangered Species Act. And then about 10, 12 years ago, we saw a further increase, a new round of heavy production. So it got a lot of us talking about, is there a different way to perhaps own and manage timberland? And I happened to, in 2009, stumble into a seminar put on by the U.S. Forest Service for a new program they were launching called the Community Forest Program. Had never heard of a community forest, didn't know what they were. Turns out they've been on the East Coast for perhaps 200 or longer years. They're common there, not so common here. But I took that idea back to a meeting of the Nisqually River Council, in which all the major partners in the watershed get together every month and said, boy, what do you think? And Steve Pruitt, who was the vice chair of the River Council, got up and walked over and put this $20 bill on my table. And he had written on it, first $20 of $40 million for the Nisqually Land Trust Eatonville Community Forest, donated October 16th, 2009. So that started a round of informal talks among our many partners in the watershed. We started to educate ourselves by first answering the main question, what's a community forest? And it really is a working forest owned and managed to benefit the local community. On the one hand, fairly straightforward. On the other hand, fairly complex. As Brian mentioned, we received in 2011 a grant from the National Park Service, a planning grant, which basically loaned us Brian and his team to facilitate on a more formal level these discussions we've been having. And over the next 2 years, we had a 4-person planning team, which was Brian, Justin, Kirk, and myself, and a 26-member advisory group consisting of private citizens, local businesses, governmental agencies, timber interests, whoever we could drag into the discussion. And we chewed on this question. What is a community forest? What would a Nisqually community forest be if we could create one? We took exploratory trips. We traveled to Maine, sent a contingent to look at the biggest community forest in the country in Maine. And those who are fans of Walden, Henry David Thoreau, might be interested in learning that he self-exiled to Walden Pond, in part because he had burned down the Concord community forest, a factoid we came back with. We issued our summary report in 2013, in May of 2013, and we defined our vision. What would a Nisqually community forest be? It would be locally owned. It would be economically self-sustaining. It would be, we try to execute it at scale, 10,000 to 20,000 acres, and it would be managed to provide a suite of local benefits, sustainable forestry jobs and products, recreation, education, protected wildlife habitat, clean air and water, scenic vistas, and critically support for the local tourism industry, which is the largest economic driver in our upper watershed. We really were reimagining redefining what shareholders are and sort of redefining what profit is. What if you measured your profit in jobs produced or an amount of fish in the stream or the number of kids who get out on your trails? We then had the exercise of trying to define an ownership entity. And I put this matrix up here, not encouraging anybody to read it, but just to demonstrate that there was quite a range of choices. We engaged a group of attorneys from Seattle who've been working on community forestry for a number of years, and they presented us with 7 options, ranging from a for-profit corporation to a variety of subsidiaries for an existing corporation. We decided we didn't need a brand new nonprofit in the Nisqually. We had plenty of them already. We decided we didn't want to be for-profit. We wanted to take advantage of nonprofit status and the sort of grants and donations that would allow for. And in the end, we decided we wanted to use the Nisqually Land Trust as a vehicle because it was established already. It had a record of land acquisition. It was the land acquisition wing of the salmon recovery movement in the Nisqually. And we wanted to hit the ground running with momentum. So we formed what's called a Type 1 supporting organization. It is a 501c3 subsidiary of the Nisqually Land Trust. It has its own board, who are here tonight. It has its own IRS nonprofit recognition. The relationship between the land trust and the community forest is that the land trust appoints the board. Other than that, the community forest operates as a separate entity. It can buy, sell, and manage land. It can take on loans, it can hire employees, it can harvest timber, it can do all of these things. We incorporated in July of 2014, and in September 2014, we had our first board meeting up on the banks of Busy Wild Creek in what would become eventually the community forest. And then we had to go about building our forest. And I put these charts up here to illustrate one of the highest priorities, which was salmon recovery. These charts are taken from the Nisqually Tribe's Steelhead Recovery Plan, the first one in Puget Sound. And it called out, this was in 2014, and it called out the Michelle system as highest priority for protection and benefit here. And then within the Michelle system, Busy Wild Creek, highest priority for protection and restoration, and really was a big red flag that Busy Wild Creek needed to be protected. We needed to change management, forest management. What we learned was that steelhead need bigger landscapes than, for example, Chinook. Riparian areas alone weren't enough. We had big, steep, big, high slopes we needed to protect, and we needed to manage forest. In particular, to address water and stream flow during the spawning seasons. The Michelle River, here we are during the drought year, when the temperatures were lethal for salmon and water quantity was lethal for salmon. And this is an increasingly common situation on the Michelle system. So we were able to begin an acquisition process. This is the South Fork of Busy Wild Creek, our target area. We acquired the 3 sections, 640 acres each, over 3 years, with a great group of funding partners, the Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration Program being the lead funder for us. And we submitted, the Nisqually Tribe and the Nisqually Land Trust put together a proposal for the Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration Large Capitalization Program, a special program, a competitive program for out-of-the-box size salmon recovery and water protection projects. We were one of 34 proposals submitted in 2014. We were ranked #1 with what was then a radical strategy, which proposed community forestry as a steelhead recovery strategy. We were the only project funded by the state legislature that year. We were later, funding was later followed by funding from the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program, Pierce Conservation Futures, and the program that first introduced us to community forestry, the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Program. And in fact, our proposals were ranked #1 in all of those programs, but we still came up short of money. We came up $750,000 short for the last half of the last section. We had 6 weeks to come up with the money. The Conservation Fund, a private nonprofit, stepped in, loaned us the money for 3 years. We shook piggy banks and found $250,000. We were still $500,000 short with the clock ticking down. The Puget Sound Energy Foundation announced in 2018 it was starting a new funding program, environmental partnership program, invited folks to apply, including us. We sent in a proposal, and sure enough, we were ranked, fortunately, ranked #1. We received a $500,000 loan to pay off our a $500,000 grant to pay off our loan. And the community forest is now solvent. We developed a robust management plan that Kirk's going to talk about in his presentation for the 1,920 acres. We are engaging what we call ecological forestry. The forests we acquired are very dense. They need to be thinned out to encourage those old growth characteristics in the trees. Kirk will talk about that. We have provided steady forestry work on our lands to a local family, the Scarcella family. It's Tony Scarcella, his company. Kirk will talk about that in more depth. And we also secured the most popular trail in the Mount Tahoma Trails Association's hut-to-hut cross-country ski network, the largest no-fee public network in the country, and a major economic driver in the Ashford area in winter. The Land Trust and the Community Forest secured the most popular trail, the Copper Creek Trail, which exists at the pleasure of the landowner. Our ownership of the land means that trail and the Copper Creek Hut will be there basically in perpetuity. Great partnership, wonderful folks, all volunteer nonprofit, the Mount Tahoma Trails Association. We also assigned ourselves to be innovative in any way we can. And back in 2016, as I think a lot of folks watching this webinar will know, the Land Trust, under Paula's guidance, developed the first carbon credit program in the Pacific Northwest, registering our credits on the California market and selling them all to Microsoft. First conservation project Microsoft had ever done in the continental US. This carbon project adjoins the Nisqually Community Forest lands, and it adjoins other land trust lands. And this was a 520-acre project. And just this year, we signed on a contract to develop a new carbon project on the community forest lands and the land trust. That'll be 3,400 acres. That 520-acre project was the equivalent of taking 6,600 cars off the road. This will be a 3,400-acre project. So another source of revenue, another source of growing our trees. And I'm going to leave my presentation there. Of course, we'll be taking questions. And of course, we encourage you to please get involved. We're working on keeping the community and community forest. Right now, you can let us know if you'd like more information or would like to get involved. Email Justin at nisquallycommunityforest.org. And thanks. Now I'll turn it back over to Brian and over to Kirk, I think.
Okay.
As soon as I stop sharing. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. I'll be very quick. I want to introduce Kirk Hanson again, who is going to talk to us about our management plan and what we've been doing to on-the-ground management in the forest. Kirk, take it away.
All right, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Joe. So yeah, I want to take you into the world of ecological forestry and some of the silvicultural strategies that we're using at the community forest. But first, to give you a little bit of context, the community forest is located squarely in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, just a few miles west of the snow-covered slopes of Mount Rainier. So the community forest is located in a heavily dominated landscape. It's dominated by commercial forestry, as you can see by the patchwork mosaic of recent clear cuts and regrowing forests. And as Joe mentioned, the Nisqually Land Trust property is immediately to the south, their Mount Rainier Gateway property. Given that the land was acquired from Hancock Resources, an industrial timber manager, forest cover is dominated by dense, mostly young, even-age plantations. Ages of the various stands of timber range from 20 to 60 years old, with the oldest stands at lower elevations in the western portion of the property, and the youngest stands at higher elevations over in the eastern portion. Elevations of the community forest extend from 2,100 feet where the Busy Wild exits the property near the northwest corner, up to a height of about 4,600 feet along the eastern property line. This puts the forest squarely in the Pacific silver fir vegetation zone. That being said, the majority of the forest was replanted to Douglas fir following prior clear-cut harvesting, in particular sites below 3,000 feet, again, over in the western area and down along the riparian areas of the Busy Wild. However, given how prolifically the endemic species of the site, silver fir, grand fir, western hemlock, naturally regenerate, the current forest is comprised of a hodgepodge of all these different species. Given what we anticipate from climate change, though, it's highly likely that warming temperatures will result in the Pacific silver fir zone retreating to higher elevations and Douglas fir becoming more dominant at the elevation where the community forest occurs. With the acquisition of the approximately 2,000 acres of the community forest occurring up through 2018, the first task was to develop a comprehensive forest management plan that articulated our ecological, economic, and community objectives. With the completion of these plans, we have now transitioned from planning to forest management implementation. This is a stand map of the community forest that illustrates all of the forest management units as well as the management schedule for each of the units. We organize the various management units into three basic management pathways in order to define the long-term trajectories of the forest. These pathways include old forest, long rotation, and adaptive management. Stands designated as old forest will be managed solely for late successional or old growth characteristics and functions. These units may only be thinned once or twice, then left to allow natural disturbance regimes to serve as the primary agents that shape future forest structure. Old forest stands occur primarily along the riparian areas adjacent to the busy wild and some of its tributaries, as well as extremely steep slopes, excuse me, and cliffs that present either sensitive or unique habitat types. Additionally, we've designated a variety of upland sites as old forest in order to bring more late successional structure into the upland forest areas. Stands designated as long rotation will be managed primarily for timber production, but hence the name on a longer rotation, such as 80 to 100 plus years, in order to optimize their contribution to watershed hydrology, as well as more complex wildlife habitat and carbon sequestration. These stands span the majority of the upland areas that have slopes less than 50%, where ground-based logging is most feasible and the least impactful, as well as being well away from perennial streams and sensitive hydrologic sites. Adaptive management stands serve as a hybrid of both old forest and long rotation management strategies. They will be managed in a way that prioritizes and accelerates late cereal conditions, but allows for ongoing selective timber management. These stands tend to occur on steeper slopes where ground-based logging isn't viable, as well as adjacent to seasonal tributaries. So I'd like to focus for a moment on the ecological objectives of the community forest. The primary objective, as Joe stated, is to improve water quality and fish habitat. As Joe stated, also, Busy Wild Creek feeds a system that supports threatened steelhead and Chinook runs. So improving late summer stream flows and reducing sediment and temperature are our main goals. A few years ago, we worked with Bob Kane at the EPA to use their Velma model to understand the effects of forest cover on the hydrology of the Mayshell River watershed, of which Busy Wild Creek serves as the headwaters. Velma stands for Visualizing Ecosystem Land Management Assessments, and amongst this model's various magical qualities is its ability to simulate stream flow dynamics given different forest cover scenarios. One of the outcomes of this model was the confirmation that older forests have the potential to dramatically increase late summer stream flows. And this isn't surprising given that we already know that younger forests transpire soil moisture at a rate more than 3 times that of older forests. But up until now, we haven't had the ability to quantify the difference. So managing for older forests across the entire community forest is one of our long-term objectives. Another strategy to improve watershed hydrology is to both open the canopies of currently dense forests and create gaps. Studies by the University of Washington have shown that snow melts at a faster rate beneath the canopy of dense forests, and gaps in the forest accumulate more snow and are capable of retaining snowpack later into the spring season. Retaining snow at higher elevations provides for a slower release of moisture to groundwater and therefore stream systems. Another ecological objective is reducing extremely high stocking densities. Given the nature of hemlock and true firs to prolifically naturally regenerate, stands that were originally planted at a standard stocking density of 350 trees per acre may now have densities of 2 or 3 times that amount due to natural ingrowth. Overstock stands can stay in a competitive stage for decades, slowing their succession towards late cereal conditions and running the risk of a number of issues, such as insect and disease outbreaks, increased fire susceptibility, lack of understory browse, and just a general lack of habitat complexity and biodiversity. So what we are aiming for are much more structurally complex forests that include diverse tree species of all ages, natural regeneration in the understory, spatial complexity, including gaps and areas of high density, as well as multi-layered canopies. We also want the forest to recruit some of the most important structural features for rare, threatened, and endangered species, such as large snags and down logs and large trees with large limbs and complex crowns. In contrast to the homogeneous landscape of even-age plantations, we also want to create and or retain existing gaps, meadows, rock balds, and other open areas. These unique habitats provide opportunities for a whole suite of other plant species, which attract browsing animals, pollinators, birds, and other wildlife that find limited habitat in closed and simplified plantations. So now I want to turn to some of our economic objectives. This year, we're wrapping up our third year of timber harvests. In 2018, our first year of harvesting, we thinned about 24 acres, producing 400,000 board feet of timber. Last year, we thinned about 25 acres and harvested 176,000 board feet. And this year, we're still logging up there, but we'll be wrapping up about 40 acres and another 435,000 board feet. In looking at soil productivity across the forest, we calculated that the soils are capable of producing over 750,000 board feet of timber on a sustained basis. So harvesting at or below that rate is something that's often referred to as a sustained yield or an annual allowable harvest. And so as you can see, we're well below that threshold, which really is more an artifact of the limited capacity of a single logging contractor than anything else. We hope to get closer to that harvest level in future years, mostly so we can thin out the backlog of overstocked stands and get the forest on a good trajectory to develop larger trees and more complex forest structure. We've modeled timber harvest for the next 100 years and are working on thinning in 5-year increments. This revenue will allow the community forest to become financially self-sufficient relative to management and ownership costs, and gradually wean itself off the grant funding treadmill that has propped up conservation efforts in the Northwest for decades. One of our economic objectives is to support local jobs. And in fact, like Joe said, our logging contractor, Tony Scarcella, grew up in the Eatonville area. And we also frequently use local road maintenance contractors and are considering leasing the rights to harvest various non-timber forest products such as floral greens and mushrooms to local harvesters. If we're able to sustain an annual harvest of 750,000 board feet, this translates to 8 full-time jobs. During logging operations, there are typically 3 to 4 people working full-time in the woods, so the other jobs come at local sawmills and downstream within the lumber industry. One of the advantages of having a logging contractor who is a member of the same Scarcella family that you see working on DOT road projects all over Puget Sound is that he has unique connections with the road building and fish passage industry. Through these connections, he's helped us to sell what are called fish logs that go into in-stream restoration projects associated with stream crossings. These fish logs often fetch 2 to 3 times the value of conventional saw logs, allowing the community forest to not only capitalize on a high-value niche market, but directly contribute to fish habitat improvements in other watersheds. In the past year, the community forest has achieved the coveted Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, certification. This is an international third-party forest certification that is lauded as setting the highest environmental standard for forest management in the world. It's also an eco-label that you will see on various wood and paper products that can provide a premium to forest owners when they sell their logs. In our case, a regional pulp and paper company, Nippon Dynawave, is paying $3 to $4 a ton more for FSC certified pulp logs, which results in a not insignificant value increase for timber harvested from the community forest. Further, Blue Source, the carbon broker for our upcoming carbon project, requires all participating forests to be third-party certified before they engage in a carbon contract. So our approach to thinning, which by and large leaves the largest, healthiest, and highest quality trees behind, sets the stage for optimal growth and production of increasingly higher value timber in the future. We're able to achieve both economic and ecological objectives simultaneously in that larger trees sequester more carbon, provide more habitat benefits, and are more financially valuable. So I'd like to close by providing a brief overview of our silvicultural strategies. A broadly used term to describe the type of silviculture we're using is uneven-aged management. This means that over time, we'll be creating a forest composed of multiple ages and species of trees, in contrast to the historic even-aged forest management strategy that resulted in the homogeneous plantations that currently dominate the landscape. This image is a compressed representation of our general approach to forest management. We'll use a variety of harvesting techniques to break up the current homogeneous forest composition and begin introducing increasing spatial heterogeneity. In general, we'll be using variable density thinning techniques to create uneven stocking with some areas of higher density and some areas of lower density. We'll punch holes in some areas of the forest to create canopy gaps. Some of these gaps will be replanted or allowed to naturally regenerate to recruit a new cohort of trees. And at some point, we may need to come in and begin some pre-commercial thinning and species adjustment within these young regenerating forests to adapt to climate change and optimize growth. A fundamental goal of uneven age management is the stimulation of natural tree regeneration in the understory, where the endemic tree species present in the forest reseed themselves following logging. Over time, the forest begins developing multiple cohorts or ages of trees. And in the long term, this results in forests with very complex canopies that support a much greater breadth of wildlife species and much more diverse timber products. In basic terms, this can be achieved through both retaining a dispersed population of trees and or harvesting groups of trees in small patches. Here's a drone image of a recently thinned stand that we were just working on this summer, and you'll notice how open the canopy is. This gives the crowns of the residual trees ample room to grow and therefore remain in a robust growth phase, accelerating development of larger trees. The open canopy also allows for a higher rate of snow accumulation and retention of that snow later into the season. And here's a drone image of one of our log landings. Once we're finished at this location, the landing will serve as a gap in the forest canopy that will soon be colonized by a wide diversity of brush species. The gap will also accumulate a higher snowpack through the winter and again retain that snowpack later into the spring season. And finally, just a pretty slide of a recently logged site, and that's not too bad to look at. So this is what ecological forestry looks like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. So that concludes our two presentations, and the rest of our time this evening will be for Q&A. So I will now turn it over to Justin, who's going to facilitate our discussion. Justin?
You bet. So we do have 4 questions to be answered live so far, and please feel free to ask more questions as they occur to you. The first, I think, will go to Kirk and was probably somewhat answered later in your presentation, but how are you meeting the return to local communities in terms of job/economic growth or return? So far, is that return defined specifically with numbers, dollar signs, etc., or more generally?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, I'd say we're defining it both in dollar terms. We look at the logging revenue, probably 60% of the logging revenue that's generated off the community forest is going back to the local community. That's what's getting paid to the local logging contractor, getting paid to the truck hauler who's hauling the logs to the mill, getting paid to the road maintenance contractors. So economically, that's the way that we're measuring that. Like I mentioned, we're also looking at selling non-timber forest products that would provide revenue to those types of contractors. But more broadly, looking at some of the social returns, like Joe mentioned, we have hiking trails up there, cross-country ski trails, lots of opportunity for recreation. We are having discussions about opening up the property for other community experiences, nature walks, et cetera. So there's both a kind of a broad range of economic and less easy to quantify community benefits. But Joe, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it pretty well. It's we do see the community ski trail being an important economic driver up there, of course, and who knows what we'll have in the future. We've talked about lots of different things. When we were first, way back in 2013, when we were meeting and talking, mountain biking came up as both a recreation activity and also a strong means of economic support for the area. And who knows, we may be able to work that in at some point. We're learning as we go.
All right, our second question has actually been asked several different ways, but are there plans to acquire more of the private plantations in the future? And do you work with the neighboring landowners for wider landscape scale environmental benefits? Or do you stand alone with your biodiversity outcomes? And then others have asked also, what are your plans to expand the acreage, vision for future land acquisition? So I think that would be you, Joe.
Sure, at least on the first part. We are, on the one hand, we're in negotiations right now we'll keep our fingers crossed to expand to double the size of the community forest. We've won some substantial grant funding. The trick is, and it's not a trick, the hard hurdle is that these are investment vehicles. These are lands held for underlying investors around the world, often very high net worth individuals or things like university endowments, stuff like that, pension funds. And it's highly competitive. We've looked twice at major auctions of lands right in our target zone that have gone on the market, and the selling prices have been in the $70 million range. And we figured out ways to get up even as high as $40 million. But when you're talking $70 million, you are at a whole different scale. And timberlands have really steadily increased in value. It's hard to get the big timberland owners to break loose the sort of properties that we can manage. So we're moving at a market pace as well. We're a conservation organization having to move at market pace. You'll see an auction announcement, and you'll have 6 weeks to come up with a $70 million offer. So we're working as hard as we can, and we hope to acquire another 2,000 acres within the next 6 months. Keep our fingers crossed. There's lots of things that can go wrong, but we may get there. So that's the answer to the first part of the question, I think.
Great. Very specific question. Bob Myrick says he used to manage the Tacoma Green River watershed. Now he's on the MTTA ski patrol. Can they be watershed inspectors to help watch over the lands? And I'm certainly any members of the public and MTTA are great partners, so I can't see why we wouldn't want to hear whatever you see and find out when you're up there. All right, going to switch to one for Paula. I'd love to hear more about using carbon sequestration as a financial tool. How does the value get calculated and certified? What did you learn from the first project that you're applying to the new one? And then there was another. Can you also say more about the increased carbon sequestration potential of diverse stands? Are there financial incentives that are available to support this benefit? So Paula?
Sure. So on to the first question. So there are existing markets out there where there's demand for forest landowners to increase the amount of carbon on their lands and to be paid for it. And one of the biggest market drivers right now is the state of California. They passed a law in 2006, which regulates large fossil fuel emitting entities in their state. And for the most part, those entities need to decrease their own emissions or trade allowances with other entities that have decreased their emissions more. But for their entire goal of the amount of carbon emissions they want to reduce, 8% of that can be met through offsets. And so the state worked really hard to come up with a rigorous carbon offset project or carbon offset program, which allows forest landowners in the lower 48 states to be able to develop projects under a really rigorous protocol. And so that's what we used for the trust. project. And so essentially the financial incentive is for people who have a requirement to go ahead and reduce their emissions to be able to find a way that's slightly less expensive than other means to meet their legal obligations. So that's one form of financial incentive. And the second form is that there's quite a few companies who are not regulated by any government, but who see that it's really, really important for the viability of their business and for their reputation to go ahead and reduce their emissions anyway. And so that creates a voluntary market. So in the Nisqually Land Trust project, we actually used a combination of the two of those things. And so we wanted the highest quality protocol, the most rigorous way of measuring and having a third verifier. And then on top of that, a government say that what we were doing was real, that the carbon emission reductions that we were getting from how those properties were managed were real, they were additional, and they were permanent. Those are the big three criteria for offset projects to be valid. And so we went with that system, but then we chose to take the credits that we got verified through a third party, through that third party, and then approved by the state of California. We took those credits and we looked for an iconic Northwest business that was also seeking to show climate leadership and chose to sell our credits to Microsoft. And they weren't just looking to offset their carbon emissions. They had very rigorous standards of trying to reduce as many emissions as they could internally. And then for what they couldn't, they wanted to look for high quality projects like ours. And so we thought it was a good partnership to look for and encourage businesses like that to invest in sustainable forestry and invest in projects like ours. So in terms of what I think then you asked like how the carbon is quantified, and really it's basic forestry measures. It's doing inventory and measuring your trees at a pretty high density and making sure you got very accurate measurements of the amount of biomass in your forest. And then there's some pretty straightforward mathematical calculations to translate the amount of biomass you have into the amount of carbon and the amount of carbon dioxide that you're sequestering. And so we hired someone to do that, and these third-party verifiers made sure that our measurements were exactly as they said they were. And we went through a whole process of every bit of calculation and paperwork and justification according to the protocol was met. So that's how we generated credits. And then, in terms of lessons for the second project, I think one of the lessons we learned is that when we have the opportunity to use that really rigorous protocol, regulatory protocol from the state of California, we'll use it. But there are other voluntary markets and protocols out there. And so we chose to use one of those for the community forest because we're going to be doing more hands-on active management. And the way that protocol was structured kind of takes into account that flexibility. It's sort of no less rigorous, but it allows us to get awarded for increased carbon sequestration in the context of a more actively managed forest. So I don't know, Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Paul, you've covered it really well. And I have to say, we would never have gotten here without Paula, because it is, as you can probably tell, it is a complex process. It takes a lot of steps. What we are seeing is, as with our community forest, we were the first community forest in the Pacific, in the Puget Sound area, second in the state. Now we're seeing many more community forest projects in Washington, Oregon, and the same with carbon projects. We're starting to see more land trusts and conservancies move into carbon sequestration programs, which is great, because one of the hardest expenses to meet over time with conservation lands is long-term stewardship of the lands. And as our forests grow, they generate more credits, and we have a steady source of stewardship support. So it's not the sole revenue stream, but it's an excellent stream to complement our other work.
Great, thank you.
So Justin, there was that second question on diversity, and I didn't hit that. Do we have time for me to do that, or do you want to move on?
Sure. Go for it.
So really quickly, I mean, species diversity in a forest does help with more carbon sequestration because essentially different kinds of trees fill different spaces in the forest. And so if you've got multiple species, some, take a position lower in the canopy and do better in shade, and other species need a little bit more openness. And so when we can, for instance, transform the land from a plantation back to a more natural forest, all of those different niche spaces get taken up, and the trees become very efficient at using the water and using the sunlight and the nutrients to transform all of that into carbon. But it also allows all of the soil microbes and the fungi to also operate at an optimal level. And so there is really interesting research that shows that that more diverse forests are better at a lot of ecological processes, and carbon sequestration is just one of them.
Great, thank you. I think this is for you, Kirk. How many years will it take to initially thin the forest to meet our goals? So that first pass through, I guess.
Well, at the rate we're going right now, at only 40 acres a year, and there's 2,000 acres, it'll be 50 years. But no, we're hoping to pick up the pace considerably. Like I mentioned, the ages of the stands up there, excuse me, range from 20 years old at the really high elevations where you've got much slower growth rates to some stands that are 60 years old, and those tend to be down at some of the lower elevations that have higher growth rates. So our first phase of thinning, of getting through everything that is of a harvestable or merchantable size right now, will probably take about 20 years. At that point, some of the higher elevation stands that are currently younger will begin coming online as a merchantable size, and we can start working into those. And given the relatively slow or the low productivity rate of the soils at that higher elevation, we're probably not going to want to come back to a stand that we thinned any sooner than 20 years. That's going to allow that stand to put on ample timber volume to justify coming back. And also by having such a low return interval, it'll allow those soils to recover from logging and it just be much less impactful. And if we're coming in, say every 10 years, as we could on higher productivity soils. So it's kind of a variable question, or answer rather.
All right, next one again for you, Kirk, is can you talk about any fire management issues or concerns?
Oh boy, West Side fire dynamics, that's a big topic. I guess I'll keep it brief and say that in general, by thinning and retaining the larger trees and using a management regime that results in a forest composition of larger, older trees that are more spaced apart, is going to create a forest type that is less prone to wildfire. On the west side, we're less of a fire-prone ecosystem, certainly, than the east side. And fires are more synoptic events. They're weather-driven events. They're less driven by fuels in the forest, such as east side forests. So we're not as concerned about fire risk, and it's not necessarily something that we're managing for as a high priority, but reducing the fire susceptibility of the forest will be an outcome of the type of silviculture that we're using.
Great. Kind of another shift to this. Can you talk a little bit about how climate change is being considered in the management plans?
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned, one of the expectations of climate change is that we're going to see the Pacific silver fir vegetation zone, where the community forest right now is located, at roughly kind of 2,000 to 4,000 feet will start creeping up. And what the next vegetation zone below that is the western hemlock vegetation zone, which tends to be dominated by Douglas fir as an early cirral tree species. And so likely what we will, and this is all going to be based on observation and monitoring, but we may begin shifting the species composition up there through our harvesting. Right now we're using a best tree selection approach to thinning, where we're retaining all of the inherent species diversity up there and retaining the trees that look like they're doing the best, have the best live crown, look the healthiest or the largest, kind of regardless of the species. So we're maintaining the existing species diversity. But if we start seeing some of these high elevation species, silver fir, grand fir, hemlock in particular, showing ill effects from climate change, basically dying off or having slower growth, we may focus on harvesting those out of the forest and shifting more of the species composition over to Douglas fir and cedar, which are more drought tolerant and more climate adaptable for this particular elevation band where the community forest is. The other thing is we're not clear cutting. On these really thin soils that are very drought prone, you clear cut, or historically they would clear cut and replant, and we would expect to see a much higher mortality rate in replanted plantations like that. We're going to be relying more on natural regeneration and regeneration in the kind of protective, shady environment of the understory of the forest. So that should help alleviate, the effects of young plantation mortality. But really, it's going to be an adaptive management approach, and that's where any forester is at these days.
Kind of one more riff on that. What tree disease issues are you dealing with, especially given our lengthy high heat drought conditions we are routinely seeing with climate change? Is laminated root rot becoming problematic specifically?
Yeah, there's a number of root rot diseases up there, Gnosis, Phalinus. Nothing that we've really seen at a level that we feel like we need to do something about it. And to be honest, we're managing, this is ecological forestry. So my euphemism for root rot in root diseases is that they're agents of stand diversification. They create snags, they create down logs, they create gaps in the forest. So we'd be inclined to manage kind of along with that natural disturbance regime. It may be that where there's a root rot pocket, that's where we'll punch in a hole and create, more of a deliberate gap, and then plant species that are not susceptible to root rot, such as cedar or potentially hardwoods. But we have a very different perspective on root rot than I think the conventional industry does. We're not looking to isolate it or eradicate it. It's part of the natural forest development process, and we're going to manage kind of compatibly with that.
Great. This is also going to be for you, Kirk, just because I know your current position. Have you worked with any faculty and students from the Evergreen State College? And if not, what are some possibilities you could envision to connect students and faculty with the community forest and more broadly with the Nisqually Land Trust?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I'm currently teaching an ecological forestry class at Evergreen. It's an elective in the Masters of Environmental Studies program. So yes, very tied in with Evergreen. That's my alma mater. I am partnering with Dylan Fisher, who's teaching the undergraduate program on forests and forest ecosystems. And we are scheming to get Evergreen to develop a accredited forestry program and use the evergreen forest as a experimental forest, much like pack forest is to the University of Washington. So check back.
I do want to acknowledge that it is 6:30 and we had originally planned this for an hour. We have a few more questions and I think all of the board are willing to stay. So please stick around if you're willing. But if you have to leave, we understand that we scheduled for an hour and that's where we are.
Thanks for joining us.
No, not you, Kirk.
Oh.
You can't. Is there a program for wildlife management on the lands as well? Is there a current audit and tracking of what species live in the forest? Are there targets for increasing certain species?
Oh, George. Hi, George.
Hi, George.
Hello.
I guess the answer to that would be no at this point.
Yeah.
It'll come with time. We're certainly doing that on the adjoining land trust properties, Mount Rainier Gateway Reserve. And for example, we have wildlife cameras out there we're managing for spotted owls and marbled murrelets. And we do have a lot of anecdotal data coming in, folks who've been walking up on those properties. And we have seen in the land trust side over the last 8 years, at least anecdotally, quite an increase in wildlife species in that area. Somebody who was up there recently who does a lot of hiking in that area told me that they see more wildlife in that area than they do in the national forest or even up in the national park. So we would hope for the same in the community forest lands. And at some point, maybe one of those Evergreen students will get out there and do a study for us.
Yeah. And Bob Myrick noted that Seattle's watershed was totally dense timber, not many large animals. Tacoma's watershed had clear cuts and power line right away. Lots of deer and elk, lots of bear and cougars. They fed the bears in the spring, and we certainly were surrounded by industrial land, so it's part of a whole matrix up there in the Michelle watershed. So,
And, I would just say really quickly, if you don't mind, I mean, just the idea of getting bigger trees, which is going to eventually lead to larger snags and more down wood. There's 150 vertebrate species in the Pacific Northwest that depend on large dead trees, either standing or down, that are over 20 inches in diameter. And most industrial plantations just don't have habitat for those critters. So we will be improving habitat for a lot of wildlife over time just through our basic management practices. And yes, it'll be great to be able to document that systematically, but I have no doubt in my mind that the style of management we're using will definitely increase wildlife diversity on those lands.
Great, thank you, Paula. Joe, is there any federal funding sources for community forests?
The U.S. Forest Service's Community Forest Program is a federal program, and we won 2 grants through that program. Although one of them, just because of the technical complications with another grant we had, we couldn't actually use the money. But that is yes, that's our main federal program that we've gone to.
Okay. 2 more questions kind of for you, Joe. What criteria have to be met to remain a nonprofit in a community forest that generates income from forestry, et cetera? And also along with that, will community forest and their management techniques ever be able to provide investors a reasonable dividend?
Yeah, on the timber harvest and nonprofit status, the land trust also does timber harvest. For one, timber, as do many conservation organizations, Nature Conservancy in particular does quite a bit of it. If it's part of your conservation work, typically for the land trust, timber production is a byproduct of conservation management. With the community forest, we set it up deliberately as a Type 1 supporting organization so it could harvest timber and remain a nonprofit. That's it's an IRS consideration. So it's set up to do that. But then again, it's set up to do that and serve a conservation purpose.
And as far as a nonprofit or community forest making a return to investors?
That would be really interesting, and we'll see. It'd be really interesting to get to a stage where we could have a local investment. We've certainly been approached, in fact, by a number of organizations to invest endowment funds and potentially things like retirement funds. That's a far more complex financial structure and corporate structure, certainly, than we've got sort of the onboard capacity to generate right now. But it's an interesting concept going forward. Whether that could be done as a nonprofit or the community forest we could create a limited liability company, a limited liability corporation, an LLC that was for profit, that perhaps might be able to do that. Or there may be ways to do that as a nonprofit too. Right now, we don't know how to do it yet, but it's a pretty interesting proposition going forward.
I think this one might be for you, Brian. how do you define the community part of community forest? And how do you keep your community engaged in the management of the forest?
Well, that's a great question. We define the community part as the benefits that we're trying to provide to the local community. What we talked about, the economic benefits and the wildlife protection and the stream protection, fish and wildlife, and also trying to open it up as best we can to public recreation or partnering with other organizations like the Mount Tahoma Ski Trail System to provide recreation on our lands. We know we need to do a better job at communicating what we're doing. I think that's one of the reasons we're doing this webinar tonight. We had decided a year ago that this past summer we were going to start offering more tours, guided tours up in the forest, maybe bring in some guest speakers to talk about different subjects of interest to the community. But then we got caught up in this COVID thing, so we'll probably start that type of work up next year. We definitely need to do more with social media. And I guess I would just say that we're a small board of 6 people. We're all volunteers, and most of us have other day jobs. I'm not trying to make excuses, but we've spent our first 5 or 6 years just getting our nonprofit status organized, fundraising to do some initial acquisitions, and then an enormous amount of time working with Kirk to develop our management plans. And just now, in the past 3 years, we've been able to even started to do any forest, logging activities up there, pre-commercial thinning. So we will get to the more community engagement parts, but it just takes time, and we're doing the best we can. I would be interested in anybody that's interested in helping us out especially with social media. People that want to do, to open up a Twitter account on our behalf or help us get a Facebook page, that kind of volunteerism would be great.
Kirk, have you heard about how incorporating wood into soils helps prevent soil compaction, which might be helpful after logging?
Yeah, actually we do that. So as we're logging and generating slash and non-merchantable wood material, the logging contractor puts all of that slash onto skid trails and places it in front of the harvesting equipment, the feller buncher, processor, whatever's out there working in the woods. So as that equipment's moving through the woods, it's actually riding on top of that slash, which both decreases soil compaction and incorporates that wood, kind of masticates it a little more into the soil and helps with the decomposition process. And also by not leaving, fine slash all over on the forest floor, it mitigates some of the short-term fire risk of that fine material. So we have a very specific strategy for dealing with the wood waste, if you will. Don't even look at it as waste. It's a resource that is utilized very carefully in the forest when we're logging.
It was noted that Northwest Track collects data in the Ohop Valley through some of their citizen science work, and perhaps they could expand and help out in the community forest. And yeah, that's definitely a possibility that we'll chat with them about. We were asked if we would offer any advising consulting services for landowners in the watershed. And I know Kirk's organization, Northwest Natural Resource Group, certainly does that. The community forest someday may, once we get up to speed and have staffing of our own, but NNRG does that service for us. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about NNRG at all
Oh, just real brief.
Okay.
So NNRG, Northwest Natural Resource Group, we're a 501c3 nonprofit also. As you're probably gathering, we specialize in ecologically based forest management, and we work with a broad spectrum of forest owner types, from conservation groups, land trusts, public entities, but really the bulk of our work is with private small woodland owners. So if you're a forest owner who's interested in an ecologically based approach to forest management, we'd be happy to help. And we do everything from forest management planning all the way through ecologically based commercial timber harvesting.
NNRG.org, right?
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Joe.
Yes, this presentation has been recorded, and we will make sure that it turned out okay, and then we'll post it probably on NisquallyCommunityForest.org and also on the Nisqually Land Trust webpage. Just two more here. Is there a size threshold to become a viable community forest and to get carbon credits?
It's I could jump in with a partial response at least, and it's kind of a follow-up to what Brian was saying. You know, when we started this process way back when, about 2009, 2010, we had a pretty robust community process going on to get the project up and launched. And then, as Brian also pointed out, and then suddenly we were trying to actually acquire lands, and that was a major push. We had a board, and when we can get to the point, really, we're getting close, where we can have some kind of staffing that can stay with things like community engagement. We'll be able to really, I think, expand that. We're right at that cusp. It's typical growth trajectory for a nonprofit to go from volunteer board to a staffed organization. And we'll see a growth spurt then. And I think that also is a response to sort of critical mass of a community forest. At 2,000 acres, we're kind of close. If we can get to 3,000 or 4,000 acres, we'll be a lot closer, certainly.
And the one beauty of having all of this is that we have a comment from Elizabeth Much, who works with community woodlands in Wales, and thanks to Eventbrite, found our webinar. She finds the scale of our ownership so different. In Wales, most groups manage small forests, less than 100 acres, and are volunteers, and they do most of the work too. The passion is the same though. This has been really revealing. Would love to share our story with her Wales network, and I will find me at justin@nisquallycommunityforest.org, and I will gladly figure out a way that we can do that. So I won't try and speak the Welsh, but Voice of the Woodland is the name of her network. I deal with the social media in Wales, but she might be a little bit too distant to help us with our social media. And we did have another person that offered to help us, and I've taken down that information. So really appreciate everybody participating. Brian, do you want to wrap everything up?
I just want to know what time it is in Wales right now. No, I think this has hopefully been great. I mean, we don't get to see all of you out there and to see what your reactions are or how this is going, but it has felt pretty informational to me. And I think there've been some really, really great questions. As Justin said, we're going to develop, I think, a slightly edited version of this webinar and get it posted on our website. And I think that the fact that we had over 100 people signed up for this webinar indicates to me that maybe we will do a few more of these in the future as well.
Yeah, and Brian, I'd jump in there and say, perhaps as a warning, we have folks' email addresses, and we'll, I think, probably attempt to set up at least some kind of regular communications about what the community forest is up to, and of course, give folks the option of opting out immediately if they don't want to receive that kind of info. But we'll make the assumption that they're interested and at least try them the first couple of times.
Sure, maybe once every week or two we can get an email out just to give little tidbits of things we're doing.
Every week.
I know Twitter is more like 3 times a day or something. But so if you do want to get on that email list, I'd encourage you to provide your email address.
We already have them.
But if there could be people listening right now that, I see what you mean. We'll automatically put everybody on it that's on this call or on this webinar.
I think so. That may not be true.
Sure. Well, and then people can opt out if they don't want it to get it.
And so it's nearly 2 a.m. in Wales.
Wales, okay. Well, I would ask any of my other board members if you have any comments before we close. George? You're muted, George. Unmute yourself.
Hello. I'm sorry I had to join everything late today. And no doubt whatever I say will just be a repeat of what somebody else said. But I want to address something that came up in a couple of the questions I heard about investment and return on investment. And one of the ideas that or at least that one of the things that I was interested in, I think we're interested, was creating a community forest, was to provide an investment environment for people who would like to invest in forest land for multiple returns, in both financial and let's call them conservation returns. And there isn't a vehicle for that really, and there could be. So not that everybody's sitting around with $300,000, but potentially $300,000 or $350,000 could buy 80 acres of land. It's potential that you provide the money, we provide the land, and we provide the income from that land back to you, with the understanding that it's not the same kind of a return on investment. It's a slow and steady return on investment, and you're part of a bigger process. We haven't got that in place now, but we intend to get that kind of thing in place soon. And I think that I want to make sure that in talking about money that comes from government or money that comes from grants or the like, we don't totally neglect the possibility of providing a service for private investors who want to invest both in a return on their own investment and in the community good. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thanks, George. Anybody else? Closing remarks? All right. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for your time and for sticking with us when we went about 20 minutes over. And with that, we'll call this a webinar. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
See you in the trees.